Great. Thank you so much, Selene. That was a really generous introduction. And thank you to Nicole and Hans and all others who have organized this series. It's really been nice for me to come back to this literature around deliberative democracy. I mean, I have kind of stepped away from it in recent years for precisely some of the problems that we're talking about today. And so this seminar series has been, again, just a really nice reason for me to come back into these discussions. And it's really great to see all of you. And so thank you for your time. The first slide, okay, this is me and what comic me looks like. This is a reference to what's going on my website. But just a little bit of the background about me. I'm a Yonsei settler. Yonsei is a Japanese word for fourth generation. It's typically used in the context of settlers, Japanese settlers in North America. So I'm a fourth generation. I was born and raised on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam First Nation over here on Turtle Island, AKA North America. And I'm also very grateful to the Colloquiate First Nation on whose land and in whose waterways I am currently way out here on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And my pronouns are she, her. So I literally just finished this paper, so please bear with me. In this paper, I'm starting from the premise that we all want to decolonize. And I think on a certain level, this is true. For the discourse of decolonization is ever so prevalent these days. But in its prevalence, it's become an abstraction, or as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang have put it so poignantly, it's become a metaphor. Next slide, please. Thank you. So my motivation for writing this paper and presenting this paper is that I want us to decolonize, not metaphorically, but in meaningful ways, that is, ways that contribute positively to the resurgence of Indigenous, land-based, and relational ways of existing. And in this paper, I want to speak to all of us who share, however remotely, the responsibility for colonialism in all of its historical and ongoing expressions. And I'm asking all of us to take a moment, or several hundred, to reflect on what decolonization means and what we have to do in order to achieve it. Only once we are clear on the imperatives of decolonization can we begin to have meaningful conversations about decolonizing X, Y, and Z. Only then can we begin to have meaningful conversations about decolonizing deliberative democracy. So I think having a clear understanding of these imperatives will enable us to minimize the risks of metaphorizing that include not only impeding meaningful decolonization, but actually upholding and deepening coloniality. But what happens if upon taking this moment or these moments, we realize that we cannot decolonize deliberative democracy or any form of democratic innovation that remains tethered to the liberal state or to liberalism more generally? Frankly, I'm not sure that we can, but in any case, it's not a bad idea to probe the possibility that we cannot. I've written before about the hope bias, which I sense in so many warm-blooded deliberative Democrats, but this bias, I think, can serve in obscuring difficult truths. So for the purposes of this paper, during the moments we have together, let's push on the possibility that we cannot decolonize deliberative democracy because of its fundamental connection to liberal ontology, values, ethics, and institutions. By pushing on this, my intention is to decenter the idea that tinkering with deliberative democracy and tinkering with liberalism can bring about decolonization. And as we have this discussion, let's also think about instead centering Indigenous voices as they articulate more relational pathways to decolonization and resurgence. None of my thoughts here are original. I want to point that out. There is a huge scholarship on Indigenous decolonization and resurgence, for example, by Leanne Batasimo-Sake Simpson, Audra Simpson, Gina Starblanket, Heidi Stark, Joyce Green, Sarah Hunt, Glenn Coulthard, and many others from whom I am learning. There's also a huge literature by scholars much more immersed than I am in this literature, as well as in critical feminist and critical race theories. So for example, Rita Kaur Damoon, Ethel Tungohan, Nisha Nath, Jaquit Singh, and many others. Indeed, much of my thinking for this paper has been informed by Jaquit's work, recent work on the impossibility of decolonizing radical democracy. So let me begin with outlines of a definition of decolonization. So next slide, please. I think the best way for me to present these outlines is through the voices of Indigenous scholars and the voices of those immersed in Indigenous studies and colonial settler studies. So Michi Sagig, Anishinaabe scholar and artist and activist, superstar Leanne Batasimo-Sake Simpson, for her, decolonization is fundamentally connected to groundedness, to literal groundedness in the land and in relationships among its inhabitants, past, present, and future. Decolonization can only be achieved through place-based ethics and necessarily involves the return of land to Indigenous people. She writes, decolonizing to me means centering around grounded normativity in my life and in the life of my community, while critically analyzing and critiquing the ways in which I am replicating white supremacy, anti-Blackness, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. For Yellowknives Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard, Indigenous decolonization is best understood as a struggle primarily inspired by and oriented around the question of land, a struggle not only for land in the material sense, but also deeply informed by what the land as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations can teach us about living our lives in relation to one another and the natural world in non-dominating and non-exploitative terms. Finally, I have another quote from the intellectual Frantz Fanon, who was born on the island of Martinique under French colonial rule, who made foundational contributions to understanding anti-Black racism and to theories of anti-colonialism. As he states, for colonized people, the most essential value, because it is the most meaningful, is first and foremost the land. So as summarized by Jaquit Singh, in the context of settler colonialism, decolonization is essentially about land, broadly understood. And in what are considered post-colonial regions, decolonization often focuses on social, economic, and political ways of collective organization and on ontological, epistemological, and ethical systems that undergird these ways of collective organization. So Singh points to, for example, Ramon Gosfoguel, who writes that decolonization requires a broader transformation of the sexual, gender, spiritual, epistemic, economic, political, linguistic, and racial hierarchies of the modern/colonial world. As Tuck and Yang write, not only does a decolonial politics interrogate existing political institutions and land on which these institutions are built, but it disrupts prevailing forms of knowledge and normativity. Next slide, please. So with these intertwined territorial and non-territorial imperatives in mind, decolonization must be deeply unsettling. It must be deeply unsettling on many levels for settlers and for all of us who have benefited and continue to benefit from colonialism. Decolonization cannot be easy. So as a number of scholars, including Rita Damoun, Bonita Lawrence, and Anushka Dua have noted, decolonization is not easy, even for those who really want to decolonize. And as Singh writes, the relationship between, quote, the relationship between decolonial and other critical or emancipatory struggles is particularly fraught, with progressives often trading on the radical connotation of decolonization while simultaneously eliding the radical content of its critique. How's everyone doing? Everyone okay? Just checking in. Thank you. Good. Okay, so pushing on. Deliberative democracy as a set of norms, practices, procedures, and so on for collective governance can be understood as an Enlightenment project to improve the human condition through collective governance based on procedural equality, the exchange of reasons, and decision-making on the basis of mutually acceptable agreements. As I understand it, deliberative democracy and democratic innovation were and remain responses to the limitations of representative democracy in realizing two central principles that are tethered to liberalism: the moral equality and freedom of all individuals as rightfully self-determining individuals. These are, of course, fundamentally important principles, but in their prioritization of the human individual who is abstracted from relationships with other humans, with other animals, with land and water, their pursuit has long served as a justification for colonial conquest and has served in entrenching the hegemony of liberalism. So I'm focusing on deliberative democracy, but even its rowdier, more critical and less establishment sibling, discursive democracy, can be understood in these terms. And again, Singh has made this kind of argument with respect to radical democracy. So even radical democracy can be seen as an extension of liberalism and therefore inherently obstinate to decolonization. Liberalism is an ideology and corresponding set of institutions that prioritize the individual human and that prioritize historically and arguably still prioritize the white, masculine, assigned male at birth, possessive individual human who takes from the natural environment to cultivate, own, sell, profit from. Liberalism conceptualizes humans as disconnected from and superior to the natural environment. They are conceptualized as disconnected from each other. We are conceptualized as atomistic. Positivism as the pathway to universal truths upholds this ontological scaffolding. Truth is what makes sense to the human mind, either in logical terms or in terms of observation, replication, and attempts at falsification. So liberalism encompasses an epistemology that centers logic, scientific methods, and universal laws. It encompasses ethical principles that center land as a resource, as property, and as capital, that center individual rights, especially to own and accumulate property and capital, that center fairness, understood largely in terms of procedural terms that tend to favor the wealthy, and that center social and political organization that advances the interests of property owners. The full expression of this ideology relies on colonialism. So if theorists and practitioners of deliberative democracy are serious about decolonizing the field, this ontological, epistemological, and ethical inheritance must be confronted. Papering over this inheritance risks not only continuing, but reinforcing colonialism, both in its territorial and non-territorial dimensions. So let's push on why deliberative democracy cannot be decolonized. Again, my intention here is to just slow us down so we can talk about this. And in doing so, I guess I'm pressing on the brakes pretty hard here. But I'll approach this piece of the discussion in terms of, first, the procedures of deliberative democracy, and second, the possible substance of democratic forums. Next slide, please, Nicole. Thank you. So what can procedures of deliberative democracy really do about returning Indigenous land, eliminating oppressive hierarchies, and cultivating relationships of respect, responsibility, and reciprocity? So returning Indigenous land, the procedures of deliberative democracy, again, are tied to the liberal state, although this is admittedly less true for discursive democracy. But these procedures don't supplant the liberal or any colonial state. They are intended to improve it, to enhance it by more fully realizing principles of the moral equality of individuals and of maximizing the freedom of individuals. And so far as these procedures seek to improve on the colonial state, they are in fact seeking to improve its jurisdictional hold on Indigenous land and to further entrench the conception of land as natural resource, therefore extraction and development. Colonial states, again, are typically based on Indigenous dispossession from their lands and cultures. So long as democratic innovations intend to improve the state's legitimacy, I don't see how they can be decolonized. Perhaps I'm missing something, but it seems to me that discussions around decolonizing deliberative democracy and democratic innovations have been quiet, if not silent, on the imperative of land back to Indigenous people. Eliminating hierarchies of domination and subordination. So how do procedures of deliberative democracy challenge sexism, racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and so on? How do they contribute to dismantling the hierarchies of the modern colonial world? Perhaps while deliberations are taking place, procedural equality, when coupled with meaningful measures toward substantive equality, can go some way toward neutralizing these hierarchies. But again, so long as these procedures are meant to supplement the state and to more fully realize liberal ideals of individual equality and freedom, again, individuals as conceptualized as atomistic and possessive, these procedures cannot eliminate these hierarchies on a longer term basis. Again, liberalism is premised on the domination of individual humans over land and over other animals. And so it's hard to see how its extension can be decolonized. It's true that deliberative democracy has become more inclusive as it has moved away from the once stronghold of reasonability and toward, for example, storytelling. But inclusion is not synonymous with decolonization. In fact, moves to inclusion and recognition by or within the liberal state or any colonial state can impede decolonization. To the extent that they do so, they are incompatible with endeavors toward decolonization. These moves make liberal institutions and the ideology of liberalism more bearable to settlers and others who benefit from colonialism. What about building relationships of responsibility, respect, and reciprocity? Deliberative democracy is often understood as an event. Deliberative systems can be understood as systems of events or series of events. Deliberative participants come together for moments of time, often as individuals, without their kids, without their elders, for example. They deliberate and then they go home. The agenda for deliberative events is often crammed packed, and there isn't any time really to get to know people, to have unstructured conversations, to make food and eat together, to share stories and so on. Yet these relationships are central to endeavors to decolonize. Decolonization is not an event. Next slide, please, Nicole. Thank you. So what can the substance of deliberative democratic substance really do for decolonization? So you might be thinking, well, can deliberative democracy serve discussions around decolonization? My response is probably not. And also, is this even desirable? I think what would be more likely is that deliberative forums become essentially an invitation to discursive violence that is obfuscated by appeals to procedural equality and the importance of discussing all claims so long as they are reasonable or perhaps just exploratory. Is it reasonable to deliberate on the purported benefits to Indigenous people of settler colonialism, of, say, residential schools? It's not. Also, anti-Indigenous racism, like all forms of racism, is often not overt, but is rather so subtle. It can be hard to tell it's happening if you haven't had the lived experience of it, if your family members haven't, and if your ancestors haven't. So if we take water as a metaphor of societies with entrenched systemic racism, suffering racism can be like drowning, which is often silent and without a lot of fuss. So those enjoying themselves frolicking in the surf nearby often don't even notice that someone is dying. Also, racism is often not intentional and often takes place at the hands of well-intending people like deliberative Democrats, like participants who show up for a couple of days to participate in a deliberative poll, for example. But in any case, is deliberative democracy even desirable for discussions intended to address decolonization? Why are we prioritizing deliberative or discursive democracy over Indigenous protocols for collective decision makings among peoples? So where does this leave us? If I could have the next slide, please. Where does this leave us in our efforts to decolonize? I don't have the answers, but I'm pretty sure Indigenous scholars, activists, and elders do. And this really is my main point. If we want to decolonize, we have to center the knowledges of Indigenous scholars, activists, and elders. But for those of us who are colonial settlers, or those of us who have benefited from colonialism, we can't just do this without a lot of prior work to prepare us to openly and thoughtfully receive this knowledge. And so in the final couple of minutes of my talk, I'll go probably just past 11:30 your time. So I just offer a few preparatory steps toward this end. So I think we need to begin by tracing the logic of liberalism and colonialism that our families and communities have internalized. So for me, my starting point is with my great-grandfather, who came to the west coast of Turtle Island in the late 1800s to fish. And this was very explicitly to extract wealth from the land and waterways of Indigenous peoples. So my Japanese family settled on Musqueam land, which is where I've long called home, and they fished up and down the coast. They acquired property, they built a life, which would be violently disrupted by the internment, incarceration really, of Japanese Canadians. But after the Second World War, they returned to Canada, and really there was a collective endeavor on the part of Japanese Canadians to assimilate as much as possible into white settler society. My family and many, perhaps most Japanese Canadians started again to acquire wealth and build their lives, but there was more. In the late 1960s, young Japanese Canadians sought to reassert their cultural identity, and part of this was organizing toward formal recognition of the theft of property and the incarceration and forced repatriation as human rights violations. Part of this endeavor was also to organize around firmly entrenching multicultural rights within the Canadian Constitution. So in other words, bolstering the settler state. So I'm very proud of my Japanese Canadian heritage, but I have to recognize how my own history, the history of my community, has been implicated in efforts to strengthen liberal colonialism. So relatedly, number two, we need to understand how we as individuals have been and continue to be complicit in colonialism, how we've perpetuated it, and how we continue to benefit from it. So we might, in this context, think about what is at stake in wanting to hang on to the ideals around deliberative democracy. In my own work, as I mentioned to you at the beginning, I've sort of turned away from deliberative democracy because I wanted to just be a little bit more active in terms of challenging racism and colonialism and sexism and so on. So number 3, I also think it's important that we actively seek realistic ways of disrupting this logic of colonial complicity and perpetuation. So we need to learn more about the history of colonialism and the ongoing legacy of violence. We need to read much more critical academics and activist literatures, especially by Black and Indigenous scholars and scholars of color. And also from areas away from the mainstream of political science. And we need to turn toward work that more directly and immediately challenges colonialism, including the embodied, the gendered, the racialized hierarchies that have been entrenched in settler colonialism and indeed the colonial world. Finally, and this is really the main point of my paper, we need to read, learn from, and draw from the works of Indigenous scholars and activists. So next slide, please. This is my last substantive slide. So Gina Starblanket, she actually presented a paper on treaties as a way of reconceptualizing governance, and especially governance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. So this quote is from Indigenous scholars, Dr. Starblanket and Heidi Stark, Dr. Heidi Stark. Indigenous scholars have emphasized the need to reconceptualize Indigenous visions of law and governance in ways that account for our position within reciprocal relations with all creation and with past, present, and future generations. As Indigenous peoples, from grassroots to academic realms, have become more acquainted with the limits of articulating our political imperatives through state-sanctioned mechanisms of rights and recognition, there has also been heightened attention to the need for political strategies that are grounded on the resurgence of a relational way of being. This shift has been accompanied by increased scholarly attention to the possibilities that treaty relations hold for reimagining social and political relations within Indigenous communities and between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Final slide, please. I will end there and just wish to thank all of you for listening. Thank you.